The morning sun peeked through the sheer curtains of the secret apartment, casting a warm glow over its luxurious interior. Susan sat on the plush, cream-colored couch, her eyes tracing the skyline of the city sprawling before her. This apartment, nestled in a discreet corner of the bustling metropolis, was a world apart from her everyday life. As she sipped her coffee, the door clicked open. Richard, her lover and boss, stepped in. His presence filled the room with an air of authority mixed with a hint of illicit excitement. "Good morning," Richard greeted, his voice a smooth baritone. He loosened his tie, settling beside Susan. "Morning," Susan replied, her tone laced with a mix of affection and a subtle hint of something deeper, perhaps longing or frustration. Richard looked around the apartment, his pride in this hidden sanctuary evident. "I still can't believe this place. It's like our little secret from the world," he said, his hand finding hers. Susan smiled, but her mind was elsewhere. "It's beautiful," she acknowledged, "but sometimes I wonder if we're hiding our happiness or hiding from it." Richard's expression turned serious. "Susan, you know my situation. I wish things could be different," he said softly, squeezing her hand. "I know," she sighed, leaning into his embrace. "But sometimes I feel like a bird in a gilded cage, free to do everything but leave." There was a pause, a moment where unspoken words hung heavily in the air. Richard broke the silence. "I promise, things will change. I'm working on it." Susan looked up at him, her eyes searching his. "And until then, we make the most of what we have," Richard replied, his gaze steady. "I can't lose you, Susan." The conversation shifted as they discussed their day ahead. Susan was due at the office soon, and Richard had meetings lined up. But for a moment, they lingered, savoring the secrecy of their relationship, the thrill of stolen moments. As Susan got ready to leave, Richard pulled her close for a lingering kiss. "Tonight, I'll make it up to you. Dinner at your favorite place?" Susan nodded, a smile playing on her lips. "I'd like that." The door closed behind her, leaving Richard alone in the apartment. He stood there for a moment, lost in thought. The apartment, once a symbol of their love, now felt like a poignant reminder of the complexities of their hidden relationship. Outside, the city bustled on, unaware of the secret lives being lived within its embrace. The next day, Susan sat at her desk in the noisy office of a moving company, the constant noise of work all around her. Her mind, however, was not on the mundane tasks of an assistant, but on a future that seemed just beyond her reach. She discreetly minimized a job listing she had been perusing when her colleague Emily approached. "Isn't working hard or hardly working?" Emily joked, leaning against Susan's desk with a knowing smile. Susan chuckled, "A bit of both, I suppose." "Just looking at some new opportunities." "Still planning your great escape from assistantdom?" Emily asked, her tone light but curious. "Yeah, I need something more challenging, Susan confessed, her eyes reflecting determination. "I didn't get my degree to schedule meetings and answer phones for—" "I get it. You've always been ambitious," Emily replied supportively. "Any luck so far?" Susan sighed, "Not yet, but I'm hopeful. I want a role where I can actually use what I learned about logistics and supply chain management." Just then, Richard walked past, giving Susan a discreet nod. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over her. She admired Richard for his business acumen, but also resented how their secret relationship might be holding her back professionally. Later that day, Susan found herself in Richard's office, discussing her day-to-day responsibilities. Richard, ever the pragmatic leader, listened intently. "Richard, I've been thinking," Susan started hesitantly, "I want to take on more challenging projects. I feel like I have more to offer." Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "Susan, you're invaluable to me here. I know you're capable of more, but I need you in this role right now." Susan felt a twinge of disappointment. "I understand the needs of the company, but I also need to think about my career growth. I don't want to be stuck in the same position for—" There was a brief silence as Richard contemplated her words. "Let me see what I can do. Perhaps there's a project that could use your expertise," he finally said, offering a compromise. Susan nodded, appreciating the gesture, but knowing it wasn't enough. She needed a change, a step up, not just a temporary assignment to placate her ambitions. As she left Richard's office, Susan felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her relationship with Richard was a part of her life, but it wouldn't define her career. She was determined to carve her own path to reach the potential she knew she had. Back at her desk, Susan opened her laptop and resumed her job search with a newfound resolve. She would find her place, a role that challenged and respected her abilities beyond the confines of her current job and complicated personal life. The journey ahead might be daunting, but Susan was ready to embrace the challenges and opportunities it would. The world saw Richard as the epitome of success, a sharp, astute general director of a thriving transportation company. At home, his life was a picturesque scene of suburban bliss. His wife Clara, with her flawless appearance and leisurely lifestyle, completed the image of the perfect family. One evening, at a company gala, Susan watched from a distance as Richard and Clara mingled with the high society. Richard's arm was around Clara, his smile never faltering. Susan felt a pang of something unidentifiable as she observed the charade. "Can you believe them? They look like they've stepped out of a magazine," whispered Emily, standing beside Susan with a glass of champagne in hand. Susan forced a smile. "Yeah, picture perfect," she replied, her voice tinged with a bitterness she didn't intend to reveal. Later that night, Susan found herself alone with Richard in his office, the gala a faint buzz behind the closed door. "Doesn't it ever get to you?" Susan asked, unable to mask her frustration. "Living these two lives?" Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated, Susan. I have responsibilities, a reputation to uphold. It's not just about what I want. But what about what's right? You can't keep juggling like this forever," Susan pressed, her eyes searching his for an answer she wasn't sure existed. Richard walked over to the window, looking out at the city lights. "I know. But right now, this is how things have to be. Clara, she's part of my life, a part I can't just walk away from." Susan walked up to him, her voice softer. "And what am I in your life, Richard? A secret you're ashamed of?" "No, never that." Richard turned to her, his expression earnest. "You mean more to me than you know." "Just what?" Susan interjected, her heart aching with a mix of love and sorrow. Richard took her hands in his. "Just that I'm trapped in a world of expectations. With you, I can be myself, but out there," he gestured vaguely towards the door, "out there, I have to play a role." Susan pulled away gently. "And I can't live in the shadows forever, Richard. I need more than stolen moments and hidden truth." The conversation lingered in the air, unresolved and heavy with unspoken promises and hidden fears. As Susan left the office that night, the gala's laughter and music echoed hollowly in her ears. The facade of perfection had never felt more fragile. Deep in the solitude of her apartment, Susan lay awake, thinking of Richard and Clara, the public image they maintained, and the private truths she was a part of. The complexity of their situation weighed on her, a reminder of the delicate balance she had to maintain in her own life. The early morning light filtered through the blinds of Susan's apartment, casting a serene glow across the room. She was sipping her coffee when her phone buzzed. It was a message from Richard. "Pack your bags for the weekend. I've got a surprise for you." Curiosity piqued, Susan texted back. "What kind of surprise?" "Just be ready. By 6 p.m. I'll pick you up." And pack warm came Richard's cryptic reply. Later that day, Susan found herself in Richard's car, heading to an unknown destination. The city lights faded behind them as they drove towards the outskirts. "Are you going to tell me where we're going?" Susan asked, her excitement mixed with a hint of apprehension. "We're going skiing in Killington Ski Resort, Vermont. I thought it'd be a nice getaway for us," Richard revealed, glancing at her with a smile. "Skiing, but I don't even know how to ski," Susan replied, a touch of worry in her voice. "That's the fun part. I'll teach you," Richard said confidently. They arrived at a stunning ski resort, nestled amidst snow-capped mountains under the starlit sky. The grandeur of the place took Susan's breath away. As they settled into their luxurious suite, Susan couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. "This is beautiful, Richard, but why all this?" she asked, gazing out at the snowy landscape. Richard wrapped his arms around her. "I wanted to do something special. Something just for us." The next morning, Richard was true to his word, patiently teaching Susan the basics of skiing. They laughed and stumbled, the crisp mountain air filled with their shared joy. But as the day progressed, the physical exertion couldn't distract Susan from the thoughts swirling in her head. Sitting by the fireplace that evening, Richard noticed Susan's distant look. "What's on your mind?" he asked, handing her a mug of hot cocoa. Susan hesitated before speaking. "It's all this," she gestured around. "It's wonderful, but it feels like you're trying to compensate for something. For the secrecy, the limitations of what we have." Richard sighed, setting his mug down. "I know it's not ideal, Susan, but I want to make you happy, even if it's just for a weekend." Susan looked into the fire, the flames reflecting in her eyes. "Happiness isn't just about grand gestures, Richard. It's about being able to share your life with someone openly and honestly." Richard reached for her hand. "I wish I could give you that." "You deserve the world, Susan." As they sat in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound, Susan pondered the complexity of their relationship. The trip was a beautiful escape, but it was also a stark reminder of the reality they would have to face once they returned to their hidden world. The ski trip, initially a blissful escape, gradually became a backdrop for deeper revelations. Susan and Richard found themselves amidst the serene beauty of the Killington ski resort slopes, yet their conversations increasingly veered towards the unspoken tensions in their relationship. One evening, as they sat in their resort suite, the fading light casting long shadows, Susan broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "Richard, we need to talk about us," she began, her voice steady, but her hands nervously clasped together. Richard, who had been gazing out at the snow-covered mountains, turned towards her, a sense of apprehension in his eyes. "I know," he replied softly. Susan took a deep breath. Whatever this is, it can't go on like this forever. We're in a standstill, and it's not fair to either of us." Richard nodded, his expression somber. "I understand. I've been thinking a lot about this too. It's just that every decision seems so complicated." Susan's frustration was palpable. "Is it? Or are you just afraid to make a choice? Because every day we continue like this, we're choosing to stay in this limbo." Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped. "I do love you, Susan. You have to believe that, but leaving my wife, upending my life, it's not easy. I'm not asking for you to make a decision this second," Susan said, her voice softening. "But we can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not." The room fell silent, the tension hanging heavily between them. Richard finally spoke. "I don't want to lose you, Susan, but I need time to figure things out." Susan looked away, her heart heavy. "And what if time doesn't change anything? What?" Richard reached out, taking her hand. "I don't have all the answers, Susan, but I promise you, I am trying to find them." As the night wore on, the conversation shifted to other topics, but the unresolved feelings lingered. The trip was supposed to be a romantic getaway, yet it had exposed the cracks in their secret relationship. The following morning, as they prepared to leave the resort, the air was filled with a sense of melancholy. The beauty of Killington Ski Resort couldn't mask the complexities of their situation. Working on the flight back, Susan gazed out the window, lost in thought. The trip had been a turning point, but not in the way she had hoped. The realities of their relationship were clearer than ever, and the path ahead seemed daunting and uncertain. The return journey from Killington Ski Resort was a quiet one, with both Susan and Richard lost in their own thoughts. As they drove back from the airport, the city lights seemed to blur together, mirroring the uncertainty of their future. Once they reached Susan's apartment, Richard finally broke the silence. "Susan, we need to figure out where we're heading," he said, his voice tinged with a seriousness that was rare for him. Susan turned to face him, the resolve in her eyes evident. "Richard, I can't keep being the other woman. It's eating away at me." Richard ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. "I know it's unfair to you. I hate that I've put you in this position. But leaving Clara, it's complicated. There are so many things to consider." "Like what, Richard? Your reputation? Your comfort?" Susan asked, her voice rising slightly with emotion. "It's not just that," Richard replied defensively. "There are financial implications, the company, our families. It's a mess." Susan sighed, a sense of exhaustion creeping over her. "But don't you see? There will always be a reason, always something holding you back. I need more than just weekend getaways and secret nights." Richard looked down, unable to meet her gaze. "I wish I could offer you more. I truly do." Susan's expression softened. "I don't doubt your feelings, Richard, but love isn't just about feelings. It's about choices, actions, and right now, our actions are hurting more than they're helping." There was a long pause as the weight of her words hung in the air. Maybe it's time for me to step back, Susan finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers. Is that what you want? I don't know what I want anymore, Susan admitted. But I know I can't keep living in the shadows. I deserve to be more than someone's secret. Richard reached for her hand, but Susan gently pulled away. I think I need some time alone, Richard. Time to think about my future, with or without you. Richard nodded, a look of resignation on his face. I understand. I'll give you the space you need. Just know that I do love you, Susan. With those final words, Richard left, leaving Susan alone in her apartment. She stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door, the silence echoing around her. That night, Susan lay in bed, the events of the past days replaying in her mind. She realized she was at a crossroads, with each path leading to uncertainty. But one thing was clear. She needed to find her own way, make decisions that were right for her, regardless of Richard. As dawn broke, Susan felt a sense of clarity. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready to face whatever challenges came her way. She was determined to emerge from the shadows and into a life that was truly her own. Months had passed since the pivotal conversation that ended Susan and Richard's secret relationship. Susan sat in her new office, a space she had earned through her determination and talent. The view from her window overlooked the vibrant city, a stark contrast to the hidden apartment where she once escaped the world. Her phone rang, breaking the tranquility of the moment. It was Emily, her former colleague and steadfast friend. Hey, Susan, how's the view from the top? Emily's voice was cheerful. Susan laughed lightly. It's not exactly the top, but it's a new perspective for sure. The power, I heard about your promotion, logistics manager, right? That's amazing, Susan. Thanks, Em. It's been a journey, but I'm finally where I want to be professionally. Susan replied, a note of pride in her voice. And how are you doing, personally? Emily's tone was tentative. Susan paused, reflecting on the past months. I'm better. It was tough, letting go of Richard, but it was the right decision. I'm rediscovering who I am outside of that complicated mess. That's great to hear. You deserve happiness, Susan, real happiness, Emily said warmly. Thanks, Em. I'm getting there one step at a time. As the conversation ended, Susan gazed out of her window, her mind wandering back to the days with Richard. She remembered the love, the secrecy, and the eventual heartbreak. But more importantly, she remembered the lessons learned and the strength she found within her. A knock on her office door brought her back to the present. Come in, she called. A young woman, her new assistant, stepped in. Ms. Reynolds, you have a meeting in 10 minutes. Susan smiled. Thank you. I'll be right there. As she prepared for the meeting, Susan felt a sense of accomplishment and peace. She had faced her fears, embraced change, and emerged stronger. Her story was not just about the end of a relationship, but the beginning of self-discovery. She had learned that true happiness and fulfillment come from within, from making choices that align with one's values and aspirations. Looking at her reflection in the glass, Susan saw a woman transformed. No longer defined by her relationship with Richard. She was her own person, confident and capable. The epilogue of Susan's story was not an ending, but a new beginning, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of self-belief. It was a reminder that sometimes the hardest paths lead to the most rewarding destinations,